Hello and welcome to today's European SharePoint Office 365 and Azure Community webinar. My name is Shane and I'm delighted to be joined by Shabaz Dar, Netcompany United Kingdom, who will be talking to you today about Azure Identity and Access Management Overview. Remember to join the conversation about today's webinar on Twitter. Our Twitter handle is @EuropeanSP and our hashtag is ESPC21. Don't forget to check out the Resource Center. This is updated daily with the latest blogs, ebooks, webinars, and how-to videos. Simply visit sharepointeurope.com and click the content link at the top. Welcome to Azure Week, one unmissable week of free online Microsoft Azure learning. For full details, see sharepointeurope.com/Azure-week. After the webinar, we will have a questions and answers session. Type any questions you have in the questions window. Questions will be selected and answered at the end of the presentation. This webinar will be recorded and added to the Resource Center, where you'll be notified by email when it is available. And now I'm going to pass you over to our webinar presenter, Shabaz Dar. Hello, Shabaz.
Oh, good afternoon or good morning, depending on where you are.
No problem. Shabaz, if you could share your slides. Yep, I can see them there. Take it away.
Excellent. Put my camera on as well. So thank you for that introduction, Shane, and thank you for everyone who's attending. I just want to give a quick thank you to the European SharePoint and Microsoft 365 community for hosting this webinar. So it's a massive privilege for me to be doing this session. So for those who don't know me, I'll do a quick introduction. I've got my kind of moniker is I'm the IT geek. As you can see, there's my kind of Twitter handle and my LinkedIn, and I've got a YouTube and a blog as well. So a little bit of information about me before I get started with the content. So that's me. My name is Shabaz Dar, as I was mentioned before. I'm a senior infrastructure specialist at Netcompany, and I'm based in the UK, United Kingdom. If you couldn't tell by the accent, I'm from the north of the United Kingdom. I've got about 15 years or over 15 years experience working within the IT industry. And for the last seven to 8 years, I've been working with Microsoft Cloud and some AWS Cloud as well, but majority Microsoft Cloud sort of services and tools. My main focus is on Azure, so mainly the infrastructure as a service element, endpoint manager, and also what was Windows Virtual Desktop. I should have corrected that in the slide to AVD, what it's now known as. But those are kind of my main areas of focus. So my presentation today is all around Azure Identity Management, or Azure IAM, as it's also known. So in my experience, there are really 3 areas that are available to us when it comes to identity management within Azure. And those 3 areas I will be covering in this presentation, and they are Azure Active Directory, or Azure AD. We'll then take a look at hybrid identity. So that's a mixture of Azure AD and on-premises or Active Directory. And then finally, a third element of identity management that I'd like to touch on is Azure Active Directory Domain Services, which is it's really a combination of Azure AD and Azure AD on premises as well. So it's more of a service, domain controller service. But I'll get into more detail around that within the presentation. So firstly, I'm going to talk about Azure Active Directory in a bit of detail. So I'm going to be discussing, what is Azure Active Directory. We'll take a look at some of the licensing requirements that you need around Azure AD. And then I'll look at some of the pros and cons of this service. So first of all, what is that, Azure Active Directory? It's Microsoft's cloud-based identity management service, which integrates with all the sort of Microsoft SaaS elements, as well as some of the other Azure services. So here we're talking about Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, Microsoft Teams, OneDrive, just to name a few of those sort of SaaS services that it integrates with. And like most Azure cloud services, Azure Active Directory or Azure AD for short, I suppose, has different levels and features, all dependent on the subscription that you assign a user. So that'll be part of the sort of licensing element that I discussed shortly. So you can secure Azure AD with multi-factor authentication and also conditional access. And again, there are different means and methods that you can deploy that MFA with. You can do it through a text message or a phone call, automated phone call, as well as using a Microsoft authentication app on your smartphone. There's also Azure AD also integrates with what is now known as, I suppose, Endpoint Manager or Intune, and this allows you to essentially manage your devices and integrate that with compliance and configuration policies for Windows 10 devices. And again, those Windows 10 devices have to be enrolled into Azure AD for you to manage them and for that integration piece to occur. So as I mentioned, I wanted to touch on some of the licensing as well. So there are I suppose there are 3 or 4, depending on which way you look at it. I'm going to discuss 4, but there are some different types of elements, different levels of Azure Active Directory licenses. So whenever you create a tenancy within Microsoft 365, you automatically get a free Azure AD Basic license. So this provides user group management, a sort of limited self-service password change for cloud users only. So if you've got like a hybrid account, which again we're going to discuss shortly, you don't get that you don't get the self-service password reset with that. It's cloud-only accounts. You can also use some of the single sign-on capabilities in Azure as well, but again, with it being the free basic version of Azure AD, you don't get all the full feature set of the SSO capabilities. You also get some sort of third-party integration as well with some third-party SaaS apps as well. Again, not all applications because it is just the free version. As well as those cloud aspects, there is limited integration with on-premises Active Directory. And again, that meaning you can sync accounts, but again, the full feature set and capabilities you don't get in the Azure AD Basic Free. But I'll discuss that further in the hybrid section when we get to that. So the first, I suppose, paid for license for Azure Active Directory is called Azure AD Premium 1. So this has all the same features. Well, you'd expect it to have all the same features as the Azure AD Basic, but also it has some additional features as well. So it has a lot more support for those hybrid users that we mentioned. You have advanced administration, including dynamic groups and cloud password write back. So what that means is if you have a synchronization with an on-premises Active Directory domain, essentially you can do password write back, so you can change your password in the cloud and it will update your on-premises, as well as vice versa. If you update your password on premises, it will update the cloud as well. So you've got that sort of password write back and group write back element there as well. But this premium one you do have to pay for as part of a subscription. It does come as part of other subscriptions as well, but even on its own, you do have to pay for it. It does cost. Now, the third license I want to touch on is Premium 2, so Azure AD Premium 2. And again, as you would think, it has all the same features as Azure AD Premium 1. So again, it has all the features of Basic as well. However, it has some additional elements to it, especially around the security. So with Azure AD Premium 2, you get the identity protection element, the information protection element. So risk-based conditional access, some more advanced information protection element. You get the privileged identity management as well, or PIM as it's known. And these are additional features that you get with the Premium 2. It also has a lot more enhanced and granular reporting and alerting available compared to Premium 1. So it's the most expensive out of those two because it's the next level up. But again, that has a cost, and you'll find more than likely that in more of the enterprise level subscriptions like E5, it comes with Premium 2. Whereas when you look at Microsoft 365 E3, that comes with Azure AD Premium 1 license. The final sort of subscription that I just wanted to touch on is, it's probably not as a common one, but it's like a pay-as-you-go feature license. And these are essentially additional feature licenses such as Azure Active Directory Business to Customer, or B2C as it's known. So B2C can help you provide identity and access management solutions for your customer-facing applications. So again, it's probably less common than the first three, but it is another Azure Active Directory license that you can get. So now we've kind of covered, what is Azure Active Directory. We've covered the sort of licensing element. What I just want to go into now is some of the pros and cons of Azure Active Directory. So with it being a cloud service, especially a Microsoft cloud service, it's highly available. As I say, when we're hosting our sort of content and when we're hosting our services in cloud, one of the benefits of that is the high availability that you get because it's hosted, the sort of service is hosted with Microsoft Cloud in different regions and different data centers. So the highly available architecture design is spread across multiple data centers in different locations, and it's consisted of independent building blocks to provide that scale and availability. So that's kind of one of the pros of Azure AD. In my opinion, as well, the administration is a massive benefit, and by that I mean if you think about traditional Active Directory on a domain controller, you have different OUs, you'll have potentially different domains within a forest, and the sort of hierarchy of the OU structure. It does have sort of a higher administration footprint and overhead as well. Whereas with Azure Active Directory, it's just one pane of glass. So you've got a centralized administration of users through different locations. So for your enterprise sort of level organizations that have users across multiple locations, rather than them having their own potentially domain or within a forest or their own OU structure, they're all just in one single pane of glass. So it makes it much easier to just do a search and find users. So definitely administration for me is a positive and a pro around Azure Active Directory. Single sign-on, so with one identity, you can access thousands of SaaS applications, both on-premises applications using single sign-on and also third-party vendor applications. And you can achieve that single sign-on through the different synchronization methods, which we're going to discuss when we talk about the hybrid. So I'll go into that in more detail, but definitely single sign-on is what I feel is a massive benefit of Azure Active Directory. It has really granular reporting, especially when you're getting to sort of the Azure AD Premium 1 feature set. You can pull off not just sort of audit reports and see who's been logging into which service, but you can also look at the location of the logins. So depending on what your sort of policy is within your company or organization, you can have conditional access policies that can block logins from specific locations that are on like that are maybe a part of the world where there's more suspicious sort of activity. So again, the reporting gives you a lot more granular view of who and where access requests are coming from. So definitely reporting is a massive benefit for me around the Azure Active Directory. As with any service, it's not all good. It does have some negatives around it, and there are just. But again, I've only been able to kind of mention a few. So for me, there is on-premises integration, but there's no on-premises integration unless they support SAML or it requires additional configuration. And again, that's something I'll talk about more in the hybrid. There are different elements of configuration, but I feel some of the limitations of the on-premises integration with you needing more administration and more configuration is probably a negative for me. Oops, sorry, apologies. And again, this is one I think we'll probably all feel. There's massive reliance on Microsoft 365. So if there's any outages, it can cause a lot of issues. We've seen, there's well documented some of the sort of incidents and outages that have happened within Microsoft Cloud. And when identity is one of those outages, your Exchange is affected, your SharePoint is affected. it could affect your entire organization depending on how much of a footprint you've got in Microsoft Cloud. So that is quite a big negative for me as well, the reliance that Microsoft 365 has on Azure AD, especially those SaaS products. So those are the two sort of negative elements I could think of around Azure Active Directory. So that's this section done. We've obviously covered quite a bit around the sort of cloud-only identity management, which is Azure Active Directory in this case. We've covered what it is, we've covered the licensing, and now we've just covered some of the sort of pros and cons around this service. What I'd like to do now is just move on to that hybrid identity management and what that entails. So, like I said, the second type of management in Azure for identity is hybrid. So hybrid identity is essentially where you have an Active Directory domain on premises, on a Windows server, for example, and you have Azure AD in the cloud, and you use a tool called Azure AD Sync to synchronize your objects from on-premises to cloud. Excuse me. So that doesn't, and I use the word objects because it's not just user accounts. You can synchronize devices, you can synchronize groups, or you can just synchronize just passwords. So there's different objects as well as user accounts that you can synchronize using Azure AD Sync. It all depends on what you've configured. Excuse me, so a quick glass of water. What happens when you do a lot of talking, your throat gets a bit sore. So there are three main ways in which you can set up the hybrid identity, and they're all via the Azure AD Sync tool. So the first one is password hash. So password hash is essentially in Azure AD, it stores the password in a hash form. So that synchronizes the password hash from your on-premises domain to your cloud hosted domain, and it's always the same domain. So you will say you have good old contoso.com, or for me, for example, I have iamitgeek.com. I have a domain controller on premises, and I have added that domain to my Microsoft 365 tenancy. So then I have that domain in both areas, and I essentially sync my on-premises accounts to my Microsoft 365 Azure AD hosted domain. And what it does is it synchronizes that password hash only. So again, it means you can have the same password both when you're logging into on-premises and when you're logging into your cloud hosted solution. So just some of the sort of pros and cons I'll discuss as well of password hash. There's then pass-through authentication, which I'm going to discuss in this section. I'll go through some of the pros and cons of pass-through authentication. The third element, or the third synchronization option, will be ADFS or federated, and then I'll go into some pros and cons of that as well. So just to reiterate what I just mentioned then around password hash sync, sorry, excuse me. As I mentioned, how does it sync? So essentially, it synchronizes a hash of the password, as I mentioned, and it's that user's password on premises. Active Directory on premises stores the password in form of a hash representation value, and what Azure AD Sync does is it extracts that password hash of your password, and it synchronizes that instance to the cloud. So your passwords are synced normally through this element. They're normally synced on a per user base in chronological order. So if you think about sort of how your user accounts will be set up, it will do it in a per user in a chronological order, so A to Z essentially. So while this sync is going on, you do actually have extra security, and that security processing is applied to the password hash before it's synchronized to Azure AD through that authentication service. So that's just something to keep in mind with this password hash sync. You do have extra security during that sync process. So just some pros and cons of this service. Again, like sort of any sort of service or method of synchronization, it comes with both pros and cons. So some of the pros, again, being cloud, it's highly scalable and highly resilient. It's a native Azure AD sync, so there's going to be a lot of resiliency and scalability with it. Again, I mentioned the security element to it. So it provides breach replay protection and reports of leaked credentials, since the stored hash can be used to compare against credentials found on the dark web. So again, highly scalable and resilient, and good security within the synchronization for password hash. So a couple of negatives around it. There is a slight backdoor to it. So if your Active Directory account has been locked, or you've got sort of restricted hours set or a password expiry, it won't impact the ability for you to log on to Azure AD until that synchronization happens. So you normally, the password hash sync happens every 30 minutes or so. And in this case, if you say lock out your password or you've got restricted hours, it won't kick in on your cloud tenant until that sync. So for 30 minutes, you could essentially log into your Azure AD tenancy. So again, a bit of a backdoor. Not a bit of a backdoor, quite a big backdoor. But again, something kind of negative with that I feel could be much better. So that's sort of password hash and some of the pros and cons around that. So now I want to look at pass-through authentication, or PTA as it's known for short. So this essentially allows users to sign into both on-premises and cloud-based applications using the same password. And again, with your pass-through, you have that single sign-on sort of authentication with it. You can combine, as I mentioned, you can combine pass-through authentication with single sign-on features. So when users are accessing applications on their corporate machine inside their network, they don't need to type in their password. So if you think about, when you launch Outlook or something like that, if you don't have single sign-on, you can be prompted, or you will be prompted for your password, especially if your email's hosted in Microsoft 365. Whereas with a combination of PTA and single sign-on, when you launch Outlook and you're hosting an Exchange Online, it'll just automatically authenticate. So that's essentially what pass-through authentication is, or PTA. Now again, some pros and cons of this service. Some of the pros. Again, it's lighter than Federation. So even though it has some of the features of ADFS, which we'll discuss in a second, it's a lighter version of Federation. So you don't have that overhead of kind of resources and servers that you need with ADFS. Restrictions are enforced. So I mentioned with password hash, where your restrictions don't get enforced, and if you do have like a password lockout, or you've got a password expiry, you do have a certain amount of time, a limited amount of time that you can log in on cloud. Pass-through authentication gets rid of that with restrictions enforced. Again, some negative around it. It does still support, well, it did until recently, I believe, support legacy authentication. So again, that was more of a negative for me. But again, with I think in more recent times, with modern authentication, legacy authentication is now like your SMTP and your IMAP. That is all being kind of removed, if not already. So legacy authentication isn't that big of a problem now. But when pass-through authentication first came in, it did still support legacy authentication. So yeah, that was just one of the negatives I could think. So that's essentially pass-through, and that's the second synchronization method that I want to discuss. What we're going to look at now is federated ADFS, and you're probably thinking, is that still around? Yes, it is, and it's still supported in certain scenarios. Now, before I get into that, I think Microsoft don't recommend that you don't necessarily build an ADFS farm or an ADFS service if you don't already have an existing one. So I suppose if you have an existing ADFS federated farm, this is potentially what you would utilize it for these services. But I don't think they recommend you especially creating ADFS for a new service. They probably recommend more password hash or PTA. So what is federated? What is ADFS? It's a collection of domains that have established a trust, essentially. That level of trust may, however, but typically include authentication, and almost always includes authorization. So you'll hear that when you're working with ADFS, you will hear authentication and authorization quite a bit. You can federate your on-premises environment with Azure AD, and you can use that federation for authentication and for authorization. The sign-in method ensures that all users' authentication occurs on premises. So Whereas with the other two sort of synchronization options, it can sync with cloud. With ADFS, there's a massive reliance on your on-premises domain controllers. So all your authentication happens on premises. With ADFS, this method allows administrators to implement more rigorous levels of access control. So from an administrator's perspective, you do have a lot more control than you would if you're using password hash or pass-through authentication. So that's why, in a lot of cases, organizations who do have ADFS tend to choose this over maybe the other two methods. So just some again, like we have done previously, just some pros and cons around ADFS. So it does support it has a lot more support for third-party MFA and custom policy claims and rules. So again, the way Microsoft are developing Azure AD, there's more and more support and more development going on. So password hash and pass-through aren't too far behind, but there is still a lot more third-party integration with MFA support. It's certification-based authentication as well, which again is just another level of security when it comes to your authentication. Cert-based authentication has always been a lot more secure than other sort of authentication bases. So again, it's just another positive around ADFS. So some of the negatives around it, for me personally, there are a fair few. There's a large amount of infrastructure and resource footprint required. Again, because it's hosted on premises, you may have, depending on how large your organization is, you may have a farm of ADFS servers. You may have 4 or 5 servers, and that's 4 or 5 VMs that you potentially need. You need to water and feed, patch, make sure they stay online, sort of alerting, monitoring. So it can be a big administrative overhead, and for me personally, that's a negative. You need to think about firewall exceptions as well. Those are a requirement to make sure that, especially that you're not just allowing all traffic outbound and inbound. Obviously, you want to make sure it's secure as well, and you do require firewall exceptions in a lot of cases. And again, just adds to that management overhead. With it being so heavily based on premises, that can limit your scalability. Highly scalable sort of infrastructures on premises are a lot harder to manage than they are in the cloud, because it's you can automate in the cloud. It's a lot more difficult to automate on premises. And again, another negative which probably isn't on here, but there's such a massive reliance on your on-premises infrastructure. If you sort of lose that connection or you have an issue on premises, it'll affect your cloud resources as well. In some cases, organizations may host ADFS on virtual machines in Azure, but it tends to be more on premises. So here we have covered that sort of your hybrid element, where we've covered Azure AD synchronizing with Active Directory on premises, including different sort of synchronization methods. We've covered password hash, which is which extracts that password hash from your on-premises account and then synchronizes that in a secure manner to your Azure AD account. Then we've covered PTA, or pass-through authentication, which has a lot more better integration with single sign-on, and again, it's more of a lightweight federation. And then we've covered ADFS, which is your traditional ADFS that before Azure AD Sync came along. ADFS is how you created that single sign-on, or that with on-premises to Microsoft Cloud. That was a lot of years ago. We've come a long way since then. So we've covered sort of your hybrid element there. The third area of Azure Identity and Access Management that I wanted to cover was Azure Active Directory Domain Services. So what I will cover in this section of the talk or webinar is, what is Azure AD Domain Services? How does it work? And then what we'll do is we'll cover some of its main features. So first of all, what is Azure ADDS or Azure AD Domain Services? So Azure Active Directory Domain Services, it provides a managed domain service such as domain join, group policy, access, lightweight directory services or LDAP, and also your Kerberos or NTLM sort of authentication. Now, these are all the same features that you get with an on-premises or, I suppose, virtual machine hosted domain controller, or your traditional Azure, a traditional domain controller. However, rather than it being an actual role on a Windows server, it's in fact a service, again, hosted by Microsoft Cloud. So it's something you configure and you provision through the Azure portal. And it's totally separate from having your domain controllers on premises. So as you think, we've discussed Active Directory synchronizing with Azure AD. In this instance, your Azure AD domain services, although you can have the same domain as you have on premises, they're not actually connected in any way, apart from that they have the same domain. Because what happens is Azure AD synchronizes with Azure AD DS, but at the same time, you have a separate sync that's going on, totally separate from that, with your on-premises AD to Azure AD. So that's how you get the same domain and the same user accounts. In actual fact, if you have, say, a VPN connection between where your domain controller on premises is hosted and your Azure tenancy, if you have so you have that same network connection, you have to host your Azure AD domain services tenant on a different network that has no connection or join to your on-premises domain, because it won't allow you to, it sees it as a new domain essentially. So it is disjointed from your on-premises domain, even though it's the same domain, the same domain name. So that's just something to be aware of with Azure AD domain services. So that's the what, I suppose, we've covered. So now we need to cover the how. So how does it work? So as I mentioned, it's a managed domain on a VNet. So it provides identity services and it creates a managed domain tenancy almost, but you need to have a virtual network or a VNet in your Azure infrastructure as a service element. And it sits in there, and essentially when it's provisioned, it gets assigned 2 IP addresses. So that is essentially 2 domain controllers on the back end somewhere in a Microsoft data center that we don't see. We just see those front-end private IP addresses. So it has to be hosted on a virtual network. As I mentioned, it does integrate with Azure AD. So when you first provision Azure Active Directory domain services, it takes about 1 hour to provision the service, and then it takes about another hour to do that first sync. But after that, it's a kind of almost like a live sync. So it fully integrates with your existing Azure AD tenant. This integration allows users to sign into the service and applications connected to your managed domain using the existing credentials that you've got. You can use existing groups, user accounts to secure access to those resources. So the same sort of role-based access control you might use with your SaaS elements, you can use with Azure AD domain services as well. And this feature, Azure AD domain services provides a smoother lift and shift of your on-premises resources. So if you think about infrastructure, if you're wanting to move legacy, so you might be in an organization that's on a journey and they want to migrate legacy applications. However, those legacy applications have to be hosted on a server. They can't be transformed into a SaaS application. So this sort of Azure AD domain services is perfect for that, because what you can essentially do is migrate that virtual machine into Azure infrastructure as a service and join it to your AD/DS domain. And what that allows you to do is keep that legacy application and keep using it in the same way you would, because it's still hosted on a Windows server and it's still domain joined. Again, as I mentioned right at the start and in the About Me section, I'm a massive Azure Virtual Desktop fanboy, as I've been called before. So again, Azure AD Domain Services has great integration with services like AVD. Again, it allows you to domain join your your session hosts without having to have that sort of VPN connection with where your on-premises domain controller is. So it's a very good service for your infrastructure as a service elements of like your virtual machines that you need to domain join without having that VPN connection. So just some of the features I want to cover as well, again, because it does have a lot of similar features, I suppose, to on-premises domain, as we'll see. So first one, as I mentioned earlier, is domain join. So unlike with Azure AD, where you can't domain join a server to Azure AD because it just all it stores is that password hash. So we're talking about Windows 10 or server operating systems. You need, if you want a cloud service to domain join rather than having that VPN connection to where your domain controller is, you need to have Azure AD domain services. As long as the device that you're trying to domain join has access to the subnet where Azure AD domain services is being hosted. Remember, we mentioned in the last slide, you need that VNet, and then you have a subnet where your Azure AD domain services gets provisioned to private IP addresses. Whatever you're trying to domain join has to have access to that. So you could technically domain join an on-premises server to your Azure AD domain services, but you need to have that VPN in place. The better use case, I suppose, is where you have on-premises virtual machines that you want to domain join. Again, I've used this quite a bit. High availability. It's hosted in Microsoft Cloud in multiple data centers. So Azure AD DS includes multiple domain controls. As I mentioned, you get 2 IP addresses, private IP addresses. So you have multiple domain controls, and they provide high availability for your managed domain. So this is highly available and guarantees service uptime and resilience of failures. Think about on-premises domain controllers. Even if you have multiple ones, having that automated high availability is still difficult to implement on-premises. So with Azure AD domain services, because it's all hosted in Microsoft Cloud, it's all automatic, and it's Microsoft's responsibility as well. We talk about the sort of responsibility model that is well known. For those people who do use Microsoft Cloud, they'll know that model. And it's part of that. This is one of the services, the high availability, that's Microsoft's responsibility from this services perspective. As I mentioned, one of the features is that it's fully integrated with Azure AD. So we're not just talking user accounts, group membership, credentials. They're all automatically synchronized and available with from Azure AD to Azure AD domain services. One thing to note, and this caught me out the first time I provisioned Azure AD domain services, and I know it's caught several other people out, but when you first provision Azure AD domain services, once it's fully operational, your Azure AD users have to change their passwords for that first sync to occur. That includes admin accounts as well. So, you may have it where I've had it before when I provisioned Azure Virtual Desktop in my lab for the first time, going back about 18 months ago. I couldn't domain join the session host. I was getting frustrated, and then when I looked into it, I realized I'd not changed the password of my global admin account. And until you change that password, your Azure AD accounts cannot access any resources, be it admin accounts that are trying to domain join, or you're trying to log into an already existing server that's domain joined already, until they change their password. So please keep that in mind, that you do need to do that password change before you can have that sync. So as I mentioned, Kerberos and NTLM as well. So Azure AD domain services fully supports NTLM and Kerberos authentication, and which allows you to deploy those applications that rely on Windows integrated authentication. So this, as I mentioned, your sort of legacy applications, this is probably more of a feature for those aspects where like I said, you have a virtual machine with an application that requires Kerberos and NTLM. You're trying to decrease your footprint on premises. So you want to migrate that service somehow into cloud. That application might not support, your sort of SaaS-based authentication, be it SAML or whatever. It might not support those. So you need to move that whole virtual machine into Azure. With ADDS, with Azure AD Domain Services, it allows you to do that because you can domain join that VM to Azure AD Domain Services, and you'll get that full Kerberos and NTLM support that you require for that application, for that sort of legacy authentication to occur. So my presentation is coming to an end now. I know we're only about 40 minutes in, so we'll have plenty of time for questions. Just want to go through a summary of what I've covered in this talk, just for those who might not have joined at the beginning. So we've covered 3 different variants of identity and access management within Azure. The first one was cloud only, which was, I suppose, Azure AD. And within that, we covered what is Azure AD, which is a cloud only identity management service. We covered some of the licensing. So we discussed Azure AD Basic, which is the free version you get when you create your first tenancy. Some of the features available for that. We covered Azure AD Premium 1. And again, that's a paid for subscription, which has more, even though it has the same features as Azure AD Basic, it also has additional, for example, more multi-factor authentication support, more conditional access support. And then you have the sort of the password write back and sort of the group write back and the account write back. And it supports password, self-password reset as well for those hybrid accounts. We then discussed the Azure AD Premium, which is the sort of top level license you can get for Azure AD. And again, that includes all the same elements and features of Azure AD Premium 1, but you get additional security around the privileged identity management, and you get a lot more granular reporting and alerting around Azure AD. The second sort of Azure identity management that we discussed was hybrid. So hybrid was a mixture of essentially connecting your on-premises domain controllers or your domain to your Azure AD using a tool called Azure AD Sync, and that allows you to have a hybrid identity management solution. So you're synchronizing. There's different elements of synchronization that we discussed, including password hash, which essentially synchronizes or extracts a password hash from the domain on-premises domain user account and securely synchronizes that with your cloud account, making that essentially a hybrid account. There's also PTA or pass-through authentication, and that is more of a lightweight federation, and it allows you to do more. It essentially allows you to log on to your corporate account and your cloud applications with the same username and password. So it's got a lot more single sign-on capabilities and features. Finally, we looked at, in the hybrid element, we looked at ADFS or federation. And again, I know this is more of an older technology, but it's still fully supported in Microsoft Cloud. And that's a very heavyweight federation. So you need ADFS servers on premises and the authentication, whereas with the 2 other authentication methods that can be done in the cloud, ADFS authentication is controlled on premises. So you have a lot more reliance on your on-premises infrastructure and network. And that allows you to do more and enhanced third-party MFA and claims integration with your cloud applications. But again, for me personally, it's my least favorite authentication method and synchronization method, just because it's a very administrative overhead. You could, and it's a lot harder to scale it and make it more highly available. And so those are the first 2 identity and access managements we looked at. The third and final one was Azure AD Domain Services. And this is probably the newest sort of service around identity management for Microsoft Cloud. And Azure AD DS is essentially a hosted domain controller as a service. So in the back end, it is 2 domain controllers and you get 2 private IP addresses. But you get all the very similar features as you would on premises, like NTLM authentication, domain joining, and also LDAP. You get all those same features, but without having to manage your virtual machines with your domain controller, not having to manage the patching, the alerting and the monitoring and all that side of it. And that's all dealt with by Microsoft. So those were the 3 aspects I wanted to cover today. Thank you very much for watching. Again, as you can see on the screen, I've got my socials there. Please feel free to ask me any questions or reach out to me if you have any more questions around that. But I'll probably look at some questions now. Share we okay to look at some questions?
Sure, thanks for a great presentation. And yes, Shabazz, now we will start the questions and answers part. Should you wish to ask a question, please type it into the questions window now. Okay, first question, in your experience, what are the different use cases where you would look to utilize CLOR, CLOUR, only IAM or hybrid?
Cloud, sorry, that probably meant to say cloud. Um,
Right.
Sorry. Yeah. So the question there is, in my experience, where would you use sort of cloud only or sort of hybrid? Again, it all depends on the organization, I suppose. I mean, in my experience, I have migrated a customer from who was essentially they were hosted and they wanted to go fully cloud. And again, I think the COVID pandemic has probably brought cloud only to the forefront, and a lot more businesses and organizations have gone cloud only. I suppose if you're an organization that just sort of uses SaaS applications, you have a very low and minimal on-premises footprint, then I suppose going cloud only and using Azure AD only would be that way forward. And by that, I mean, you're using Exchange Online, you're using, you're hosting services within SharePoint Online, you're using Teams for your collaboration. That's a good use case for going to a cloud only identity management. So you don't have that requirement, and what you can do is as well, you can integrate that with Endpoint Manager and Intune to manage your devices. So that I have done that sort of migration before. So that would be the scenario where you're using majority cloud SaaS applications, where you'd use cloud only identity management. For a hybrid, I suppose hybrid is probably the much more popular one. As I mentioned, COVID probably has brought forward people going cloud only in some cases, but the majority, in my experience, have gone hybrid, and that's because of of people having to work from home and but you still need to utilize certain services. Azure Virtual Desktop is one service that's just skyrocketed in during the pandemic in the last 18 months, and that requires some sort of domain controller. So utilizing hybrid identity management and then synchronizing Azure AD with ADDS has been a big one. I've done a lot of those sort of migrations and those sort of integrations, implementations. So I suppose the use case where you still have a heavier and bigger footprint on premises, but you also want to start migrating into the cloud, you would use more sort of hybrid identity management in those sort of scenarios. Hope that
Okay,
answers the question.
super. Okay, next question. So if you sync from on-prem to Azure, the password hash is definitely stored in Azure?
The password hash is always stored on premises. So originally that's where it extracts it from. But yeah, in Azure with the password hash, that's all it extracts. It doesn't extract any other information from your on-premises password or your on-premises account. So yeah, to answer the question, the password hash will be stored both on premises and in Azure AD.
Okay. Does the password hash sync occur every 2 minutes, not 30 minutes as outlined?
Good question. I'd have to check. I believe it used to be, last time I checked it was 30 minutes, but they may have changed it. Microsoft are changing things every day, so it might have increased to 2 minutes. But again, I'd have to double check. It normally tells you in the portal. So yeah, again, I might be wrong. It might be the password hashes are every 2 minutes, but the sort of the user accounts are every 30 minutes, maybe. Because again, if you create a new user account, that gets synchronized as well. So it could be 2 minutes. I'd have to check. Like I said,
Okay.
Microsoft are changing things every day, so that might be something that's recently
Yeah,
happened.
we have some comments coming in saying it's 2 minutes. So there you go.
Okay. Can I
Okay.
stand corrected? 2 minutes. I apologize.
Okay. Can you give us an idea what cloud first auth is?
Cloud, what? Sorry.
Cloud first auth authentication is?
Cloud first authentication. Um,
Yeah.
Again, I'm not 100% sure. I'd assume that means that it synchronizes from Azure AD rather than on premises first. So again, I think when you've got sort of your when you're synchronizing through sort of password hash and PTA, that'll synchronize, that can authenticate both on the cloud or from on premises. Whereas with ADFS, it uses it does the authentication from your on premises only. I'm not 100% sure if that answers the question, but
Okay, perhaps the person asking can come back with further details. It was mentioned at Azure AD as a reliance on Microsoft 365. Can you please explain or expand on this?
Actually, sorry, I meant that Microsoft 365 has, so your SaaS applications have a reliance on Azure AD. So an example, if Azure, so SharePoint, Exchange Online, OneDrive, Microsoft Teams, they all authenticate and to Azure AD because that's their identity management platform. So if Azure AD goes down for whatever reason, it has done historically in the last year or so. I remember a couple of incidents where Azure AD has had issues. All those SaaS applications would be affected. So, whereas if you had a DFS implementation, you could still authenticate and log in. So that's what I meant by, I think I might have missaid the sentence if that's what I said. I meant Microsoft 365 has a very heavy reliance on Azure AD. That's kind of what I meant. I hope that explains it.
Okay. Is there a possibility to register same domain name on AADS and on-prem?
Yes. So yeah, that's fully possible. So like I mentioned, the synchronization between on-premises AD and Azure AD is totally separate from your synchronization of Azure AD and ADDS. And what you need to ensure that you do when you're provisioning Azure AD domain services is there can't be a network connection between your on-premises domain and the VNet or subnet where you are hosting your Azure AD domain services. Otherwise, when you're trying to provision Azure AD domain services, it will detect that domain because it's the same domain, and you'll basically get an error saying, but this domain or this forest already exists, and you can't provision it. So you have to provision your Azure AD domain services domain, even though it's the same domain name. You have to provision it on a network that's not connected to your on-premises. So in some cases, you might have that VPN to on-premises. You just have to provision it in a different VNet that has no connection, if that makes sense.
Okay, and the last question that we have here, Shabazz, in your experience, have you seen more of a trend with organizations going to a fully cloud identity management platform or hybrid?
So I think before COVID hit, yes, I was seeing a lot of more of a trend with clients going to, especially with smaller to medium businesses that had smaller on-premises footprints and used mainly the sort of SaaS applications. A lot of the smaller businesses, I wouldn't say enterprise have definitely gone hybrid because a lot of them have large scale on-premises or they might be hosted with a third party, but it's sort of your traditional on-premises sort of infrastructures, servers and Exchange on-premises and stuff like that. So they've gone more hybrid, but I feel in my experience, I've experienced probably before COVID as well, that the majority of smaller to medium, or a lot of small to medium businesses I dealt with were looking at going fully cloud. And like I said, I did before COVID, I had a lot more implementations of fully going cloud. Because of what happened with COVID and the short timescales, a lot more, again, those same sort of small to medium and even enterprise went hybrid just because of time. When you are going to fully cloud, it takes so much planning, and you need to make sure you don't want to make any mistakes. You get it right and you plan it out. Because COVID hit all of a sudden and businesses had to start working from home or remotely very quickly, the organizations thought, right, let's just get hybrid for now, and we can, once we're established and working in our remote areas, we can then maybe look at migrating to the cloud slowly rather than all in one. So I think that's what I've probably experienced more.
Brilliant. And you have your contact details there on screen. So if you're watching on demand, you can reach out to Shabazz at any of the following.
Yeah, I mean, I've got a lot more videos on my YouTube channel around identity management in a lot more detail. So if anyone wants to check those out, feel free.
Brilliant. Shabazz, on behalf of the ESPC community, thank you for taking the time today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Take care, everybody.
Thank you, Shabazz. Okay, everybody, this is the end of today's webinar. Don't forget, this is all part of Azure Week, one unmissable week of free online Microsoft learning. Don't forget, later today, we have a webinar with Donovan Brown and Mark Fussell from Microsoft USA, who will be talking to you about microservices made easy, getting started with DAPR. You can register for all upcoming events at sharepointeurope.com/Azure-week. Okay, this is the end of today's webinar. Please find this webinar and more at sharepointeurope.com in the Resource Center. Thank you for joining us today. Take care and goodbye.